You know what we haven't done together for a couple of years? Go to Printers Row Lit Fest. So I'm gonna do that this morning as usual. I'm throwing my socks on, I'm running a little late. I forgot to make ice cubes for my iced coffee last night, so I'm gonna have to try and pick one up on the way to my first panel. Of course, I have a panel I wanna hit first thing in the morning. Of course, there are panels first thing in the morning that are overlapping and I had to pick which panel I wanna go to. And then I have hours later where I don't have panels, which is fine because I'm going to wander. I do have panels I wanna hit up tomorrow as well because it's a Saturday Sunday event. It's like a kind of combination, if you've never been to Printers Row in Chicago, of a literature festival and a Chicago street fair or street festival, because it is in the Printers Row neighborhood. And so there's going to be a lot to see and do. And I'm going to also need to try and do double duty because I do still have a vacation coming up at the end of the month that I don't feel prepared for. I have this thing where if it's something I'm really looking forward to or like a big thing, I sometimes kind of don't allow myself to get excited because I don't want to be disappointed if things don't pan out. And I would love to say that that's just the anxiety talking, but even recently that has kind of been reinforced in that I was supposed to go to a Pink concert when I ended up being at home because my grandma passed away. However, we are going. I have an international trip coming up, so I need to get things for that international trip. Don't worry, I have my passport, which I only say because I was at a work function a couple of months ago and someone was talking about international travel, very blasé in relation to having his passport. Anyway, so the plan is Printers Row, panels, any assorted shopping I can squeeze in as well. I will be downtown, so that will hopefully be a little easier. And we'll just see kind of where the day goes. But coffee, panel, shopping, browsing, panels. I am going to take a little notebook I bought at Paper and Pencil in Andersonville to take little notes of any thoughts I have, because I didn't really do that last time. We had a more dedicated time to chat about Printers Row, and so I had a lot of thoughts, but there were some thoughts that I had kind of lost along the way, and I just had the echoes of them. I remembered that I had them, but I could not remember what they were. Additionally, I have the book I'm reading, because this will prove very dated by the time this video comes out, probably, in how I'm kind of trying to conceptualize releases coming up through vacation, but I need to read it because I have other things I need to read. So hopefully by the time this comes out, you've already heard my further thoughts on that book. I need to stop stalling so that I can get that coffee, I can get going, and let's go. I'll take you along for the ride. We'll check back in this afternoon, this evening, tomorrow, whatever ends up happening. We'll find out very shortly, the both of us, I guess. Okay, can you tell by the sadder lighting that it is now night? It is now night, day one in the books. I am a little slap happy potentially because in a move or in a result that I'm sure surprises no one, I didn't actually get coffee this morning because I was running late, in the sense that I was running on time and I should have known to allocate an extra 15 minutes minimum for the train. So that's on me. But I did get to my first session. Here's my handy dandy paper that I did get at the first session that kind of gives the outline of Printers Row Lit weekend, which is great because the font online gets very, very small, and like when you try and blow it up, it becomes hard to read. But you know what? They got the schedule out a lot earlier this year, so small wins. Anyway, okay, so I did get to my first session, the 10 a.m. I wanted to see, that was Between Worlds, The Immigrant Experience in Poetry and Fiction by Ananda Lima of Craft Stories I Wrote for the Devil, which we've talked about on this channel, and Ogochi Nigawagu, Seasons of Separation, an Igbo Family Tale in Conversation with Jem Joyce. This was at 10 a.m. It was in a room. Actually, this was a stage I have personally never been to. It was like the first floor of the Grace Place stage. It was the first floor, and there's a second floor as well. I saw 3 stages today for my 3 different talks, which is 3 more stages than I think I've ever seen. The last couple of years I've only gone to like 1 talk and they've all been at the same stage, and the year before that I want to say all of my talks were at one stage that ironically, or not ironically, oddly enough, I haven't seen a talk at since. It doesn't matter. I was all over the place today. I walked almost 15,000 steps. Granted, that's a pretty normal amount to walk in the city. And also I went off Belmont because I needed to go to DSW today. So I did that too. Okay, so this session I wrote in my little notebook. I must say, review of the little notebook, this size looked ideal to me. I was like, it's gonna be perfect to throw in my purse and jot my little purse spur of the moment thought ideas down in, whether it be video ideas, lines I read in a book that really strike me, you know, a chore I need to get done, whatever. And so I was really excited about this. However, I learned today it was kind of difficult to write in. And ideally, I would like it to be a little bigger because like my hand would start to like come off the page in a way that made it hard to write on the side. Now, I also had a handy dandy pen that I've used many a time. Granted, this was a new pen in the sense that this particular pen was new, but it's the Just One More Chapter pen from the Bookworms pen set, and I was gifted a couple of these sets and they have become like my favorite pens. So I use this pen a lot, and I found that it didn't write super well on this paper. So I'm gonna have to figure out the pen paper magic combination, but it did mean that my pen was kind of stalling sometimes while writing, which was a little annoying, but I got my thoughts down, and honestly, I don't know that any of them are, you know, profound or interesting enough to really have needed this, but I do think it helped me kind of engage with what was going on and have something ideally to report here. So this session was, like the title indicated, about the immigrant experience in poetry and fiction, which I know is me just restating the title. And so we started out kind of talking about that idea and talking about like kind of the clash of how culture translates in terms of writing it. And I think it was Lima explored like the idea of things that can feel very true, but on the page can kind of look stereotypical, and the kind of tension of, is it feeding into cliches, which I thought was a really interesting kind of point in terms of how you funnel your own experience and then how that experience is perceived. And with that perception, one of the things that they both talked about, and I found the most interesting, kind of boiled down to the issue of craft, ironically for real this time, in relation to the title of Lima's book. But the idea, well, let me find, I think I wrote down an actual quote about how, okay, so here, the idea, space for things to reverberate. So this idea of giving the reader space on the page, not spoon-feeding everything to them, though spoon-feeding was never a term that was used. And Ugochi talked about this as well, the idea that poets like to say a lot with a little, and she also mentioned pretty specifically giving readers space. And unfortunately, we didn't have enough time in questions that I could kind of ask about this and what that means or looks like in terms of their process, because I am fascinated by this. And I think it's such an excellent point in terms of writing, especially framed within the context of this session's kind of topic, like giving the reader space to, I liked the word reverberate that Ananda Lima used because it feels very active and it offers this agency to the reader in terms of engaging actively with the work and how that language operates. And they both also talk to whatever extent, very briefly, admittedly, about cutting things. I know Ananda used an example that she had a story that she just had to accept wasn't part of craft, and the kind of freedom that cutting that gave her within the context of the book, especially after she accepted that this was just going to be a weird book, which I, as a reader, am very grateful for that weirdness. And someone in the audience also commented upon the humor in that weirdness. And so just the kind of agency it gives, or space and the economy of language gives to a reader, and then the active participation from a reader in terms of how that language operates, but also knowing how much language and how much to give a reader and how much a reader could be trusted with to whatever extent. And granted, it's all very subjective, and that was also, of course, talked about in the session. I mean, not of course, but it was. And so you just kind of have to understand that things are going to resonate for some people and not for others. But whenever you are kind of using that economy of language, there are always going to be things that fall through the cracks. And I was very interested, and I wish we had had the time to push a little further into this idea of what, in terms of like cultural exploration, can be trusted to the reader. Also interesting, I haven't read Ugochi's book yet, but the way she was describing getting tales or histories essentially from her family and transposing those in her work, and then using her narrative to kind of frame that, and how she didn't really alter the voices of her family too much in terms of both their voice and what they were relaying. That felt very kind of ethnographic to me in terms of that piece of her work. And that was interesting because the second session I went to was The Changing Landscape of Work in the US, which was with Mark Larson of Working in the 21st Century, an oral history of American work in a time of social and economic transformation, and Samita Mukhopadhyay, The Myth of Making It a Workplace Reckoning, and it was moderated by Kate Harding, not Katie. My brain took a second to process that, which was another kind of ethnographic, or at least Mark's book was another kind of ethnographic look at work in the US. And I was, of course, very interested in this because I do, in fact, work in the US, and we have seen, of course, some really drastic changes in workplace culture. And I also thought it was very successful because the ethnographic research that Mark did worked as a wonderful framing device over the course of the conversation, because we could pull real quotes from real people about how they interacted with work and their workplace and their thoughts on that, etc., in terms of framing this conversation. And in terms of framing this conversation for me personally, it was very interesting because Amita is someone whose work I'm not personally familiar with, in the sense that I didn't know her work super well before sitting down for this conversation, but I know the places she's worked, including her most recent, I think, was Teen Vogue. And I am, in fact, as you well know, a millennial. And so in my youth, the kind of glossy magazines of teen magazines were like the epitome. I wanted to work at something like 17 so bad, and I'm sure everyone did to whatever extent, because that was our kind of peak into a larger world, to the extent where now seeing videos and kind of like nostalgia reels, which I know are playing into that emotion, don't get me wrong, I know I am playing right into what they want from me, but make me kind of emotional thinking back on it and how this was our window into the wider world. So in a lot of ways, these jobs are really kind of glamorous. And she talked about the burnout kind of contrasted against that glamour and that idea that I've made it or you've made it in whatever way. And so there is a kind of dissonance you have to get over there. And they talked about cognitive dissonance later in the discussion as well. And I've had some of my own kind of reckonings with this as well, in terms of theater and this idea that they kind of brushed against, and I've kind of brushed against over the years here as well, that like you love something, but just because you love something and you find enjoyment in it and value in it, does that mean that you should be exploited for that thing? Or does that mean it should be ridiculously hard to even get a foot in the door in that thing? And also, one of the things it felt like this conversation ended up being kind of framed by, whether that was the intent or not, was we brushed against this idea of kind of the downfall of girl boss culture, which is fascinating to me. And I kind of was able to come to this realization over the course of this talk that I have always come up in this idea of girl boss hustle culture. Now, hustle culture is uniquely, I would argue, American. It's always there. It's always pervasive. But they kind of framed the start and the like real height of the girl bossification of things as 2013 with Lean In. And this was framed through a question at the very end. So it all kind of came full circle. So it's not like the whole talk was framed around this by any means, but I graduated college in 2013. And to get kind of personal for a bit, I was always a very high achieving person in high school through college. And then I entered the real world. And I was always, realistic and humble enough that I knew that the real world wasn't going to be like high school and college. I knew it was going to be a lot harder, and I knew that it was going to be hard to get my foot in the door in a lot of ways as someone without connections. But it was very hard not to buy into this mindset of kind of hustle culture and seeing my worth in relation to my achievements. And then, I started to get experience in the working world. And I'm not going to pretend that my professional life is where I envisioned it when I graduated high school or when I graduated college. But at the same time, my professional life was a kind of imaginary life at the time. I had no real concept of the real world. And I will admit that sometimes I still, judge myself. And I think we all do. We play these comparison games, whether it's online with like metrics or if it's in the real world with different metrics. And I have to work really, really hard to pull back from that, especially because I found a lot of fulfillment in my life and realized that it's not just about how much you can push yourself and the accolades. And this has been reinforced, by being laid off twice in jobs that I worked really hard at and where I was about to accrue another week of PTO before I was laid off. And so it's just that all feeds into what we're looking at. And so I think there's a huge picture here that we barely kind of skimmed the surface of within this discussion. But this is one I went to kind of on a whim because I had the two talks I really wanted to go to and felt enough of an interest and felt like I should go to some more talks, to be completely honest, because the programming overall this year, the programming is kind of hit or miss with me or for me with Printers Row. And, that is what it is. And I think that there is a breadth to the programming. So that is as it should be, because I think there really truly is something of interest to everyone. And I do think they are very good at programming talks of interest to the city. For instance, when I got out of the employment conversation, there was a big long line for a conversation about like the legacy of Mike Royko, which honestly, they probably should have moved to a bigger stage, but I did not go to that talk. So that is okay. I also had the thought in this talk and like briefly in the talk before where I got really nervous during the Q&A session or section of the talk, because Q&As are always really hit or miss and they can go off the rails so quickly. For instance, when I was an intern at the Goodman Theater in the summer of 2013, there was a reading of a play by Ike Holter in which the Q&A, the play was fantastic, by the way, but the Q&A or like the feedback portion, which is always kind of dicey on a play as a literary management dramaturgy kind of focus, because you never know what you're going to get. But the playwright can take what they need and leave the rest. But for some reason, in this instance, the audience could not, or I think one particular person in the audience could not get over their idea of the verisimilitude of how many people could fit in a 7-Eleven. And it's just like burned into my memory. Or when someone stands up, and again, I led a lot of pre-show conversations. I've led a lot of developmental talkbacks regarding work. And you always have this element of unknown, and there is a little bit of fear in me as a moderator in that. And it's been a long time since I have guided any conversations like that. And yes, sometimes I do miss it, but what I don't miss are the people that stand up and don't really have a question. They have a comment. And at a festival this large, it is what it is. I do think I was the only one that was like prepped for that to go bad potentially, and it didn't go bad. And the conversation was routed correctly by the panel as well in wake of the comment that really was kind of responding to the conversation we had been having. I just learned that I am really on the guard for that and for secondhand embarrassment, I think is what it comes down to. It's neither here nor there, but a very interesting conversation and a surprise to me in some ways. Similar, maybe not as extreme, but similar to the obituary writing panel I went to 3 years ago now, and how that was kind of a surprise to me as well. That was the same year. That was the last year that I did a video on Printers Row, but that was the same year they had the panel about book talk. And honestly, I haven't seen them being as avant-garde in their programming since then, which is kind of a bummer because that was really exciting in terms of how it was interacting. And the thing about Printers Row is that it really is programmed and presented for readers across the entire landscape of reading. And so I love that about Printers Row. And that was also one of the things I found kind of comical almost in that conversation. It was the kind of dissonance between understanding who all was in the audience at Printers Row. But I thought it was important and interesting to bring that perspective, but just as important that they program all of these other different perspectives. And it was interesting. I would argue that this year seems like it's bigger than the last couple of years. It feels like it's getting its stride back. The first year I was in the city, I remember it sprawling. I think there may have been more food options contained in the festival itself. This year, Roots had a booth of pizza slices, which was very smart. But I do think it's bigger. And I think a lot of the booths are kind of evolving as well. It's still predominantly self-published, indie published, and used books focused in terms of the merchandisers, the exhibitors. But I also saw some like Bookish merch companies. I think there was a candle company. Bookstores, you have Sandmayer's, but then Love Sweet Arrow and The Last Chapter were both there in terms of romance bookstores. And there were other bookstores there as well, including Open Books, which is used books. So there was kind of an overlap there, but that is always one of the most popular places in the festival, and people are like lining up to shop the books. So it really does reflect a really wide spectrum of readership, and that I find so special. And like I said, it's this kind of amalgamation of a lit fest and this like street festival. So there is a lot to be said about that. Now, finally was the panel that I really went down today for. The Great Divide by Cristina Enriquez was discussed. And honestly, this panel didn't turn out as many people as I expected. It was on the main stage, so we may have just been spread about, but it was such a good conversation. And I have not read this book yet, and I was feeling kind of guilty about it because, you know, it's been on my TBR. We talked about it in a monthly anticipated, but clearly I was just meant to wait until I got a signed copy. And whether you're proud of me for this or not, this was the only book I bought today, which is, you know, mind-blowing in some ways. Now, this is a book, if you don't remember, because why would you? I meant that in context of I don't expect you to watch all of my videos, though I would love it if you did. You could do that, which is a reminder to you and me that maybe you should like and subscribe. Anyway, that I don't expect you to watch all my videos. Not that this isn't worth remembering, but this is an exploration of the building of the Panama Canal, and from the way that Enriquez talked about it, particularly from the point of view of the Panamanians. And so it was so interesting hearing her talk about her process with this novel, from how she wrote it in notebooks and how that unlocked new things from her or for her, and being able to kind of swirl around the page almost in some ways, and how she talked about that changing even her writing. It was interesting too because I didn't realize she was a graduate of the Iowa Writers Workshop, and maybe I'm gonna have to pay some more attention to that. I read the Book of Unknown Americans in 2013 right out of college, and it was one of the books that I read as I was getting back into the literary fiction landscape at the time, because, you know, when you're in college, you're in kind of a bubble. And, you know, I was a new adult and exploring new fiction for the first time, and blogs were on the rise. So I was discovering books in a completely new way. So yeah, it is quite special to me for that reason alone, in addition to the fact that it is a fantastic book. And so this is a different book, and I'm interested to see how the language reflects that based on her talking about her writing style. But it was interesting to hear her talk about her research style, how she approached the research, what research made it into the book, because I think this is a fascinating conversation in relation to historical fiction that I don't get to hear authors talk about enough. I know I got to hear a little bit about it at, again, the same Printers Row a couple of years ago. There was some really good programming that day, I think. I also heard Julia Fine talk about it in her book event for Magdalena and the Dark for some more Chicago author representation. I don't think Julia's on any panels this year. Anyway, so she talked about how she knew whether research needed to be in the book or not by whether it was of import or interest to the characters, which I thought was such a fabulous way to approach it. I also was fascinated by her talking about the process of this book and being afraid almost of the scope of the book, because it does span multiple characters and points of view in terms of jumping in and out of characters' heads in a way that made me think that it's third person, but I cannot confirm or deny that because I haven't read it. Yeah, it looks like third person. And probably I should have been able to confirm or deny that because she did read a section. So that's on me. But what I found super interesting was she talked about how in her first draft, it was originally only 2 characters, and her agent or her editor, I may have written it down, editor, told her that it wasn't finished yet. Specifically that it needed to be bigger, and the only way she knew to make it bigger was either elongating the timeline or adding more characters, which I think is a fascinating specific point too in terms of how you logistically do make something bigger. And sound off below if you think there are other ways to make something bigger. But I thought this was so important because we've been talking about this a little bit recently in reviews on this channel, in that this idea of how big a world is. And I don't think there's anything wrong with contained stories. Obviously, a lot of my favorites, even this year, have been really concise and contained, and there's a specificity of language there. But this idea that the world can be bigger and you can push out, and where do those notes come in, and are authors getting those notes, etc., etc. So it was really fascinating and exciting to hear that that note was given. At the same time, even when pushing the world out more, this book is still rather succinct, especially when thinking about it in relation to historical fiction of this scope and grandiosity in terms of exploring this like major thing that really isn't written about in fiction all of that much, especially from this perspective. And it's still just over 300 pages. So we've widened the world, we've made it bigger, but it is still concise and succinct in some ways, theoretically, because I haven't read it. And so that is really interesting to note too, this idea that bigger doesn't have to mean longer. And so that was just really interesting for me as well. But I'm interested in it and thinking about it in context of her other work that I've read, which is the Book of Unknown Americans. And I mostly remember my feelings of that book more than the specifics of the book itself. I mean, I remember like the overarching plot, but I remember that book feeling very concise and emotionally sharp, razor sharp in some ways. So it was very specific. It got to the point and it had just enough to kind of tear your heart out. And so I will be very interested to see how this kind of operates in terms of the language and the scope, because that book, I may have said this already, just, 2 seconds ago, but felt much more contained. So if we are looking at like making the world bigger, and I think that contained was necessary for that emotional immediacy in that work. And so just like looking at the differences between projects, and I love Printer's Row for this because we get to think about craft questions. It's also very much a festival for writers, and so we get to engage with these ideas, and I really like getting to think about the full scope of it. Now, I didn't like shop around too much. I did a little, but I didn't really buy anything because I just bought that book. It was busy. I knew I was going to be buying shoes, so on some level I also just didn't want to carry more stuff, and I know I'm going to be spending a lot this month, so we'll see if I pick anything else up tomorrow. I did get to stop in San Myers, and I did pick up some more titles for my Tokyo TBR, and I didn't buy them there because as much as I wanted to, especially with my Indie Bookstore Day discount, I know I need to pack light, so I need to buy them digitally, even though when I looked up the prices digitally on some of them, it's only a couple dollars less. And that's sad, which also brings me back to my sadness over the death of the mass market, which, wouldn't have helped me in terms of packing light, but I did overhear someone at the Love Sweet Arrow table talking about the mass markets they had out, which were noticeably less than last year, which was kind of sad, mostly Beverly Jenkins. And this young woman said something like, oh, these look like what my grandma would read, which wasn't meant as a derogatory. And I don't take that as a derogatory in the sense that things that older women read are not bad. However, it really further illustrated a shift that I've been talking about and kind of lamenting over that we're seeing in terms of pushing away from the mass market. And that does make me kind of sad because that's the format I fell in love with romance in. And I do think there are authors that we are seeing the similar structures from in trade. But one, it's illustrative of losing the most economic book format. Because if we're looking at the mass market, and like I said, I just priced a bunch of ebooks, which are priced to make the paperback look like a more economical deal so that you buy the paperback instead of the ebook because it's only a couple dollars more. So we're losing that price point entirely with the death of the mass market. So we're losing that $9, $10 price point in a time where everything is more expensive than ever. And so that is really a bummer. But also, and I've been kind of tracking my reaction and kind of how I respond to things, but I have had or been working under this assumption and this idea that the books and the romances in mass market have a different kind of structure, and it may just be the editors working on them. I don't know. It may be that at the beginning it was more like rom-coms that were being kind of billed as romances in trade paperback. My words are struggling this evening. I'm sorry. And I know that's not true across the board anymore, right? Like you've got Cat Sebastian in trade now. You've got the likes of Adriana Herrera writing her historical series, especially because historicals are where I can transpose it the easiest. We, of course, have seen contemporaries pushed into trade as well because we used to get contemporary mass market romances, but they're not as easy a one-to-one just because life has changed as well. And so contemporaries and the experience read a little different. That could just be my perspective as well, and my perspective is all I'm going to be able to give you on any of this because most of you may think that this is out of bounds. But even within historicals in trade, I have found that a lot of them, or some of them, read differently. And it could just be I am used to the publishers I'm used to, right? So I got into a rut, if you want to call it that, with Avon, and I kind of knew, even the voices being vastly different, the pacing felt familiar. Even if we were looking at something outside antagonist versus internal antagonist, there was still a comfort in that structure. And so the upset and the updating of the structure is part of the repackaging in my mind as well. I don't have this fully unpacked, and this is quite a tangent for an offhand comment I heard at a table, but all of this continues to percolate with me for sure. Now, the plan is to go down for like 2 talks tomorrow. I don't know how long I'll stay because I do have other things I really should get done this weekend as well, and so we will see. I've never been to 2 days of Printers Row Lit Fest, so we'll see how that goes, but I want to catch... Nope, I already put my sheet away, so we're just gonna have to wait until tomorrow. The good news is the panels are later tomorrow, so I should be able to get my coffee. Okay, day 2, and I have to be honest with you. I woke up this morning and very seriously considered not going down today. My back hurts for reoccurring reasons that I'm sure many of you understand, and when I went to get ice for my coffee this morning, I realized that apparently overnight isn't long enough to freeze ice in my ice tray. And so I was really questioning everything in that moment. But then I remembered that a little bit of water always leaks into the bottom of my ice tray, into the bucket. I have that stackable thing that you get at Target. And so I had just a layer of ice on the bottom of the ice bucket that could then be turned into ice shards to go in my iced coffee. Don't worry, the bucket is clean. And so I have regained some of my will, especially because I was talking a big game yesterday about how I've never been to 2 days. And this is the year I'm gonna go to 2 days, even though I have a bajillion things to do and walked so much yesterday over the course of the festival and then shopping after. But what I really, really don't want to miss today is, where'd it go? I want to see this 1 p.m. I don't know if it's going to focus. Philip B. Williams, who wrote Hours, which is that big chunker that I talked about back at the beginning of the year, along with a couple of other big chunkers I talked about at the beginning of the year. And I have been seeing it in bookstores all year, and I'm always tempted to buy it, and something just stops me, probably the fact that I haven't been successfully reading big chunkers, but I want to read it. And so this feels like a sign from the universe that I need to read this book and I need to hear about it, especially because I'm fascinated by the kind of concept of it and the approach. And it's being moderated by Kathleen Rooney, who I've never seen in conversation somehow. And she is a local author, but Lillian Boxfish Takes a Walk, which came out moons ago. I was a bookseller at the time, but I adore that book and I really need to read more from her. But that was just such a delightful surprise of a book for me because it was about an older woman kind of at the sunset of her life, walking the streets of New York and reminiscing about the course of her life over that night. And it was just kind of a celebration of a life well lived, and getting to see a woman portrayed in that light later in life. And just the whole approach of the book was just so delicious because it was episodic in this kind of trip through memory lane, but it had this brilliant framing device. I just really enjoyed that book, and I sold many copies of that book when I was a bookseller because I enjoyed it so much. The joys of bookselling. And then if I actually get my butt out the door, I will also go to the Veronica Roth When Among Crows conversation. I have seen Veronica Roth in conversation before because she is a local author, though based on the fact that she's a local author, not as many times as you would expect. I've only seen her talk at the bookseller back when her duology was releasing. So yeah, that's the plan, and I probably won't dilly-dally too long down there today because I have other things to do, and I spent all day yesterday downtown. I was walking the festival all day. I went shopping for some things I needed, like I mentioned, and I was just pooped after that. So the goal is to be refreshed after today while still getting a lot accomplished because there's a lot I need to get done just from, life things, as well as things prepping still for vacation, channel stuff in preparation for vacation. Not that that is like the most important thing ever. I recognize that, but just trying to get ahead. So let's go for day 2. Oh, also because I'm sure you are all very concerned, I think I'm going to take a different pen today. I'm still going to take this notebook because this is the notebook that I've been writing in. I own this notebook. I have to use this notebook. I still think it's really cute. I have nothing against the notebook. I just can't write in it super well. Maybe if I have a different pen, it will change my whole life. We'll try it today. So remember how I said I was going to go to my second day of Printers Row and then just didn't talk about it or wrap it up for close to 2 months? You probably don't because we're doing this all at once, but I sure do. So let's go ahead and rectify that. First of all, I think this was my first Sunday. I've only gone one day in the past, but it just depends on the programming. And I feel like I've always gone Saturday simply because Sunday was a little quieter. So if you're looking to be able to shop the booths a little bit more actively, sure, you're potentially facing something that's a little more picked over on Sunday, but it was a much calmer shopping experience, especially or at least in the morning for sure. And I did pick up some more things. For instance, I got this embroidered shirt that says "In My Bookish Era" because I thought it was fitting, especially with the channel name. And I also got a fun straw for my coffee. So, just little things. And a couple more books, one of which is associated with a panel we will talk about. But after kind of bemoaning the lack of mass market romance selection, even at Love Sweet Arrow booth, or at the Love Sweet Arrow booth, at least to my recollection of what we talked about 2 months ago, I went back on Sunday and they did have a bigger selection, especially in relation to mass market. Also, sorry, my throat feels weird, so I don't know. I feel like my voice is sounding weird. But I went ahead and grabbed a new Beverly Jenkins jewel as I move through or continue to move through her backlist at a glacier pace. But this one was particularly intriguing to me because it involves a marriage of convenience or a marriage of circumstance. I feel like those are different and I like both, but I do think that there is a distinction there. So we'll see. Definitely excited to read this one. And for mass market romance, let's go back to Printer's Row, the beginning of September. Let's go back to the beginning of September. So if you recall, or if I said it all, I was primarily going down Sunday for one specific panel that I really wanted to catch because there was a book associated with it I wanted to buy, but then there was a Veronica Roth panel right before that that I hope to catch as well. But I went and I did get to the Veronica Roth panel, and I'm really, really glad I did. I wasn't sure because I don't think I've read any of Roth's work since The Chosen Ones or Chosen Ones, which came out in 2020 and was a really interesting exploration of heroes and chosen one narratives and the trauma of that moving into adulthood of these, you know, young chosen ones. And oddly enough, the book itself mostly made me miss the food court and the Thompson Center. That is neither here nor there. It was 2020. I was going through a lot of feelings, but I'm really glad I went to this panel. This was focused, or her most recent work have been some novellas, which I am interested in picking up and just haven't yet. I believe last year was Arch Conspirator, which was an Antigone, or is an Antigone retelling, and I've read enough Antigone to feel like I really should check that out. And then this year's release that she was talking about more actively was Win Among Crows, which is a kind of twist on Slavic folklore to how the conversation went, and I'm going to be relying pretty heavily on my notes for these two sessions I'm going to talk about because it's been almost 2 months. But I thought that this session was just so delightful and funny, and I really enjoyed both how she talked about this new work, especially when she talked about folklore and this kind of intertextuality, especially in relation to folklore. And I've got some quotes here. She said, "What makes a book unique and what you do have to say something that hasn't been said." That may be a kind of distilling of the thing, but that is the heart of it. And just this idea that you can't claim that you're doing something new, or that authors can't claim that they're doing something completely new, because it's all kind of in conversation with each other inherently, and how folklore ties into that, especially when we're thinking about retelling. So this was like really great brain food for me. I loved kind of the paths we were going down conceptually here. And especially when she mentioned the idea of urban legends and how urban legends are modern folklore. This idea that folklore as we knew it, or know it, I should say, kind of spin from the urban legends of the past. These stories that come about to scare you or to warn you off of something inherently, or to call attention to something that's inherently kind of off or scary, or to pay attention to, what have you. So I really, really liked that idea, as well as her kind of talking about the melancholy of folklore. Something that was interesting, or I wasn't expecting, I guess, was that we did still talk about Divergent a decent amount, probably more than we did in her previous talk I'd been to, though she did adamantly still say not to spoil the ending of Insurgent. But just her kind of grappling with her relationship with that series, which she wrote when she was so young, and some of the holes she wrote herself into, and some of the acknowledging of some of the things that happened in Insurgent that maybe weren't the strongest, while not wanting to speak down on readers or to readers that hold that series very near and dear to them. I thought that she handled that and navigated that conversation so well, and it was such an interesting conversation to see play out. An author who had such really intense initial success, kind of grappling with that success and how her age factored into that success, how her mental health factored into her relationship with both the series and now, and her perception of all of it, but also to write past that. And I think she had some really great wisdom for early career writers in terms of how to approach the work, your relationship with the work, and how that evolves over time, and how that will inevitably evolve over time. And I think I don't think I wrote it down verbatim because I'm not a writer, so it wasn't as immediate to me or immediately important to me, but asked a question about like fearing writing something that down the line they will hate, and how that kind of paralyzes them. And again, paraphrasing recollections of 2 months ago, Veronica Roth said something along the lines of, like, of course you're going to, at some point, hate the work, but that can't let you stop. I don't know. I thought it was a great conversation. Additionally, because she was in conversation with a bookseller from Anderson's, I believe, which I am so sorry. I did not write down the name of that moderator, and I do not still have my Printers Row sheet, so I cannot tell you. I'm so sorry. Actually, hold please. I remembered the internet exists. Okay, according to the very blurry PDF I pulled up, it says she was in conversation with Sammy Virella from Anderson's Bookshop. Caveat on the last name because it was very blurry. This is important because I liked the conversation that they had in relation to books and book recommendations. One, how supportive Veronica Roth is of indie bookstores and how active she really is in the indie bookstore scene. She seems to be a regular with Anderson's and have a good rapport with, or had a great rapport with, the moderator. Whether that was just for show or not, I don't know, but it worked. But one of the things I loved most about the conversation, there were many things, but one of them, I do not remember who, to be completely honest, said, TikTok doesn't lie to you, everyone just has different tastes. So I think we were talking about the kind of changing landscape of books and book recommendations. Honestly, 4 years ago now, 3 years ago, there was the book talk panel at Printers Row the first year it came back after 2020. And the last time I did a video on Printers Row, and I would be so interested to see that conversation revisited. I have historically loved how Printers Row has been in conversation with how the book ecosystem is kind of changing, in the sense that there was that discussion in, let's say, 2021-ish, 2022-ish. And before that, when I first moved back to the city, 2016-ish, I remember there was a panel on podcasting. And so in some ways, there is this history of being in conversation with the current moment and the current bookish moment. And I was seeing that kind of translate to a lot of the vendors this year, but I would love to see it reflected a little bit more in the programming as well, because I do think that they have a great eye for programming that really appeals across the masses. And again, I really appreciate them as a festival really recognizing the wide spectrum of the literary community in Chicago and just kind of the touch and grass of it all, right? Because it is putting you in community with this wider book world that is a lot different offline than it is online, and also putting you in conversations with things that may be a little bit more immediate to the community of Chicago as well. So anyway, that's just a programming sidebar, but just the recognition that people's tastes are different and that getting up on a high horse about recommendations doesn't do anyone any good. Additionally, kind of reinforcing the idea that genre is a marketing tool. I actually saw this recently too in relation to the conversation about fonts on the cover of books and why all these books are looking the same, which I understand to a certain degree because I do get kind of book cover blindness, but it is such a strategic decision. It's not just about copying a font. Generally, it is about placing a book in proximity to another popular book for readers to have that visual cue to be able to pick that book up. I think if you're interested in this, Fated Mates has a great, at least one great episode about the history of romance book covers. And I know they've had conversations about kind of those visual shorthands within romance in particular, which I think is just a genre where it's very codified in some ways. And part of the upset of the current moment is a lot of that being stripped away and people not knowing exactly what they're getting into when they're entering a book, which for longtime genre readers may be a little bit more discombobulating. As I wrap up my wrap up of this particular panel, I realized I wrote down a quote from Veronica Roth that I meant to send to my author friend Sarah Hollowell, which you might recognize from books such as A Dark and Starless Forest and What Stalks Among Us, perfect for spooky season. But the quote I wrote down is, "Every writer you meet is a raccoon in a trench coat," because Sarah really enjoys raccoons. So I wrote that down. So I ultimately I was very interested in this conversation, or after this conversation, in picking up her new novella, but there wasn't enough time between panels. The two panels that I wanted to see were back to back. And so I knew I wanted a signed copy at the next panel. And so I just had to scoot right on across the street and get to that panel, especially because it was at a smaller tent. So I didn't get a signed copy and I didn't get in the signing line, but I'm sure I will pick up a copy at the library at some point once I figure out my whole situation. And from there, like I said, I scooted right across the street, plaza, whatever we want to call it, to see Kathleen Rooney in conversation with Philip Williams, who wrote Hours. And to be completely frank, part of the reason I haven't picked it up is because it's $32. But now I have a signed copy, and so it's fine. And it does factor a little bit into that math that I did when I was like 16 and I could only get one book at the bookstore, whether that was an explicit rule or not. And I feel or felt like I had to get my money's worth. So I would pick the chunkiest book I could find because I didn't have ready access to the bookstore at the time. So I had to make it count. Very similar vibes. But I was so excited to see this conversation. And it also kind of reframed the book a little bit for me before going in a way that I think will be extremely helpful, things to look out for, and also some misconceptions I may have had or might have had to kind of redirect, especially because I had been kind of conceiving of this as a look at a utopia or an attempt at a utopia, similar to, I think, like the New Naturals that I read earlier this year. And Williams, in his conversation about the book, kind of shot that down. And so I'm glad because that's just a different lens or consideration. I'm not coming at it with the wrong kind of framework. It was very interesting because this is an author who is first and foremost a poet. And so we have talked before on this channel about being able to kind of clock a poet in the transition to prose in the language. But when you think a poet, often you think of much more succinct, tight language, and instead we have this sprawling beast of a book. And it was interesting because the poetic instincts were clearly indicated, are still here from both Williams in terms of his approach to the writing, but also in Rooney talking about her experience as a reader and in conversation with the book. And I think we can see it in the structure a little bit, just even as we flip through the kind of disparate parts or the like little smaller sections. So that may be how it's handled. But he talked about how ultimately this being a sprawling beast of a book actually felt more liberating and free and easier in a lot of ways than poetry. And I found that fascinating. He was not talking down on poetry at all by any means. He's still a poet first and foremost and has more work coming that way. But I think when we think about how specific you have to be with language and how you really kind of agonize over every single word, every single piece of punctuation in poetry in a way that I really don't even have the full concept of because I don't live completely in that realm. I can see what he means with this, but I continue to be excited because while it kind of redirected some of my thoughts about the book, it confirmed others, including that this is a blend of history, surrealism, and speculation. And we know I love things that kind of sit at that crossroads. That's not the right word, but it's what I'm going to go with. Also, in thinking about time, and this I am particularly excited about because not having even started the book, it's not something I thought of or probably would have thought of, but talked about hours versus hours with an H. If you didn't catch my subtle miming of an H there, and how that is definitely intentional. And I have a note here about linear time is not always compatible with how we live our lives. So thinking of the circle, not the straight line. And I love time travel, but I also love thinking about time in different ways. Maybe it's because I was forced to watch that dimensions video so many times in college. And so thinking of that fourth dimension of time, but also I just love clever structure or structure that thinks about narrative in unique ways, similarly to how I like that on stage. I like things that experiment and play. And so when it's executed well, it is so satisfying. And so I'm really excited to see what that means for the book, as well as the exploration of, again, it's not necessarily exploring utopia, but it is still exploring community and the community itself as a character. I think that is going to be very interesting, especially if we think about it in relation to the time component. I'm very excited to see how that all plays out. I'm also fascinated from a process perspective because he also indicated that this book started as a short story, and it started as a short story focused on a different character than is the main focus of the novel. And so I'm fascinated by where the kind of germs of the idea of a book are. Similarly to, I would love to hear Mariana Enriquez talk about where Our Share of Night came from. Basically, if Adela's House came first or if Our Share of Night came first, and what the relationship there is. Like, if that was a larger inspiration or if it was something that just kind of ended up in Our Share of Night, or if it was something that had just ended up in Our Share of Night that spun off into its own story. Tangent, but just kind of like where these thoughts and these ideas come from and how they can become something bigger. Also, in relation to that, he mentioned how he wanted to write about the time period in a way that didn't ignore the violence, but doesn't make it a focal point. And so I think that that is part of that idea of this separation of this community. And so I think that that may be where some of like the ideas of utopia and conversations around utopia probably come in. And I do still have this note about what is a utopia or what it could consist of. So even while it may not be exploring this community actively as an attempt at a utopia, it may still be grappling with those themes and those ideas. So we'll see. And then to kind of circle back to the kind of structure and language of it, simply because I'm kind of following the map of my notes here, Kathleen Rooney did say that this is a book that requires stamina and endurance at times. And then I have a note that I don't know who the note came from. The sentences ask for a lot of attention, which makes sense if we're thinking about those poetic instincts. I can't even comprehend paying such attention to everything on the sentence level, from like those poetic instincts to a book this big, but I assume that is definitely what is going on here. But one thing with that I really appreciate, these kind of two notes, Williams did say that I have no reason to doubt the intellectual capabilities of my potential readers. Basically, he wasn't interested in dumbing down the story because he knows the readers can handle it. And I thought that that was really liberating and empowering in a lot of ways. This idea that I'm going to give you this complex, maybe dense at times, I don't know, story, but I know you can wade through it. And just what that means, I really, really appreciated that. And that really stuck with me, especially as we've seen conversations around like anti-intellectualism circulating too much. And I think that we just distill things too much sometimes. Also, though, kind of circling back to that idea of how the language works and him paying attention to it on a poetic level, and just kind of how impressive and mind-boggling that really is. He did indicate that he was still paying attention to sound in the writing of this on the kind of like sentence level, and paying attention in relation to it being read aloud. And so I do think that based on that, the audiobook is definitely still a potential option for you. I did look it up and I think it's over 24 hours, but you know, however you want to do it. So with that, I am very glad I did get to the second day of Printer's Row. It gave me a lot to think about. I always love coming from these discussions and getting to think about the craft in new ways. I love talking about books, clearly. I'm not someone interested in writing books, but I'm always interested in talking about the craft, and I would love to be able to take or audit classes on the craft without having to write the thing, which I know isn't very fair to the people who are putting themselves on the line and being vulnerable by sharing work. But I just think that conversations like this are so important and beneficial in relation to our reading lives, because it just gives us more perspectives. It adds depth to our reading experience in being able to think about the work in different ways. And so I'm just very grateful that this is a yearly festival that is completely free to everyone, and just how special that is. I know a lot of volunteers put in so much time to this event, and I am so incredibly grateful for that as an attendee. So my ultimate book haul was pretty reserved this year, in contrast to years past where I let myself be a little freer in San Myers. I kind of reined myself back a little bit this year. So I got my Beverly Jenkins of at least the year. And then I got the 2 signed copies I was really interested in. Of course, Ours, which we talked about just now by Philip B. Williams, which I believe is a debut novel. And then The Great Divide by Christina Enriquez, which I loved. The Book of Unknown Americans years ago, and I know that there are other works that I have not yet read, but I'm very excited about this from a historical fiction angle, and I'm grateful for all of the conversations I saw over the weekend from authors new and familiar, and yeah, I'm very excited for next year going forward as well, because it's even closer than you would think now that I've waited so long to put this video out. So if you have gone to Printers Row, I would love to hear your thoughts, or if you have thoughts that have kind of spun off from any of these discussions, I would love to hear those as well. But I really appreciate you hanging out and being interested in what I have to say about my time at Printers Row, or anything about books in general ever. So thank you for that. Like and subscribe if you feel like it. Read something good, and yeah, bye.